Hello everyone, welcome to the third in the Take Better Photographs compilation of videos that my brother and I are doing to basically help me learn to take photographs properly and hopefully help you to take better photographs. So hi Brian, welcome back.
Hi Bev, how are you?
I'm in a far better place than you have been because I understand if the dreaded COVID got you.
Yeah, I had the COVID, which is why there's been a delay on this video, I must admit. It was interesting. I'll not go too much into detail, but as you can see, I'm still here, still fighting fit. I do have a bit of a rough voice, so if I come over rather Barry White on this, you'll understand why. And it's just been quite tiring. So it's nice to get back to talking to you again and to try and do some stuff. And it's really been a great excuse to take the camera out on the recovery when I could get outside from the lockdown that I've been in. It's been great to be able to get the camera out and get some fresh air, go out and take some photos. One thing I will be doing, you'll see me reaching up to do a mute every so often because I'm coughing, so I'm going to try and mute so that I don't deafen everybody. Before we go any further as well, just to remind you, this is available on YouTube and on
Instagram.
Instagram.
On my Instagram. So it's basically my name, Bev Thorogood on Instagram, and also Brian James on YouTube.
And there'll be a link below. Don't forget, on both of them, hit subscribe. If you see the button, hit it like, because that gives us a bit of a boost from YouTube and gets other people the chance to see it. So you won't have taken any photos because you've been locked down as well, haven't you?
I've been locked down and I've been incredibly busy with work. So I've actually not had the chance to get out and do the stuff that you gave me to do, which was about light compensation and or light and dark compensation, or the sort of the shutter speed. So I think we're going to sort of focus on shutter speed today, aren't we?
We are. I've got a couple of things. I'm leading us through the triangle, what I call the triangle, the ISO, the shutter speed, and the aperture, because these are the basics, the building blocks of photography for me, insofar as how to take something different to what your camera phone is going to take. And once you get an understanding of these, you got an understanding of about 99% of what the mechanics of photography is. Not the composition of photography, but the mechanics, how it all goes together. So we've looked last week insofar as exposure compensation, if you remember. Yeah. That was the knob on the top. What I'm going to do with this, we brushed onto it last week, and I said about shutter speed. And you'd had a bit of a problem with some of the photographs looking very soft focus, but soft focus across the whole thing, weren't they? And I suggested that wasn't so much that was out of focus, but that the shutter speed was incredibly slow and you were getting a motion blur because it was applying to everything. Nothing was in focus. So I'm going to start off with a couple of photographs here. If I can just share my screen.
Yeah.
And these are not the most attractive photographs in the world, shall we say. Do you know what that is?
It looks like your fence.
It is. Do you know what the blurry thing in front of it is?
Well, I think I'm seeing like a hand, I think.
You are. Basically, what I did is I took 3 photographs and I changed the shutter speed. The shutter speed was the important thing. And what I'm trying to show in this is the fact that the shutter speed has 2 functions. One, as we've said previously, it allows more or less light to come in onto the sensor because of the amount of time that the shutter is open. Remember, the shutter is almost like a set of curtains which opens, allows light through onto the sensor behind them, and then closes again. And this is measured in seconds or parts of a second. Now, this particular shot was, we'll not worry about the aperture and the ISO on this one, but this was taken at 1/10 of a second. What I was doing, literally, I was waving in front. I had my left hand and I was waving. So that's my left hand that you can see. And I was waving in front.
At 1/10 of a second?
At 1/10 of a second.
Now, that feels quite fast.
But when you're waving your hand, and it wasn't ridiculously fast waved, it was, it was if it was the same sort of wave as I did when I said hello in the beginning of this video. What I did then is I upped the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. So it's 1/10 of the speed of the previous one. Changed the aperture so that the exposure was correct, but you can see that the hand itself is an awful lot more in focus, but also the background is clearer. Because on the last one, you can see the background itself is quite blurred because there's motion on there. The camera wasn't being held steady at 1/10 of a second. On there, the background has become clearer, it's 100th of a second, but the hand is still traveling too fast. Taking that one, we're now on a 640th of a second. And it's frozen that hand in time. It's taken that, and we could even go further to 1,000th, 2,000th, or 4,000th of a second on my camera. Different cameras have a different maximum speed. But you'll see that there's an awful lot in focus there, and the hand itself seems to be more frozen in time. Still not perfect. It's still got a little bit of a lack of clarity on it. But the shutter speed, the secondary effect of the shutter speed there has been to freeze time. Now, if I stop that share, we'll come back to it again. What I did on there is I literally just adjust the shutter speed and allowed the camera to change the ISO and the aperture so that the exposure was correct. So I wasn't really interested in what they were. I can tell you that if we remember, we said about this idea of having an interaction. On the one, the slow hand, the shutter speed was 1/10 of a second. The ISO was ISO 200. Don't worry about the figures. We're just going to realize that there's an interaction between them. But the f-stop, the aperture, which is if you remember, like the iris on the lens we discussed, was f22. It was as closed down as it could possibly go. It was a tiny little hole allowing very little light in because the shutter speed was allowing a lot of light through. On the fast hand, where you could actually see it frozen, the shutter speed was a 640th. We've gone to ISO 400 now because it was allowing too much light through still, and the aperture was at f4, so very, very wide open on that one, let lots of light through because the shutter wasn't let much light through, so it was more sensitive and a big iris to let lots of light through because the amount of time the curtains were open was very, very short. So there's an interaction.
When you're talking about so the longer the second the shutter, the shorter the shutter time, or the faster
light gets through.
Yeah, or the slower the shutter speed. If you're thinking about the hand moving, I guess on those curtains, it's like the curtains coming over, and it's lots of time for the hand to pass. So it's blurring. At
1/10 of a second, it opens. The hand is traveling across, and all the time it's putting light onto the sensor, so the sensor is seeing something travel across, and then it closes.
Whereas if it's much quicker, it's like, got it.
Next to no time to move in there. And that's the reason why. So the shutter speed is really, really important. If you're going to do something like that, where does this come in? Why do we worry about this? Well, some people who are watching this maybe want to take sports photography. They want to be seeing somebody running across a field at a football game or a baseball game or a cricket match or whatever. They want to catch the ball in midair so that's nice and clear. They may be going to a motor racing event. Now, all of those require a fast shutter speed. You want to freeze that thing in time. If you're taking nature photography and taking photographs of an animal or a bird, you don't want it blurry as it goes past the brook or past the trees. You want that animal to be frozen in time so that's clear and crisp, because that's your main part of your focus. So fast shutter speed for that is essential. Where do you maybe not need a fast shutter speed? If you're taking a landscape, and especially if you're wanting, if you're taking something of, say, a running brook, a running river, to get that lovely creamy sort of water effect as the ripples come down. To get that, you really need a very slow shutter speed so that the water itself is all blur. But if you can keep the camera still, say on a tripod, the rest will be sharp. Now that's really creative. That allows you to have creativity. That wouldn't work with a fast shutter speed because the water would be frozen in time and you'd see the surface. It wouldn't give you that wonderful sort of white creaminess.
Movement, yeah.
So this is where the creativity comes in. And again, when I've said about how camera phones don't necessarily give you the best shot because they're doing an idealized thing, this is where you can take the bounds out. And just knowing about shutter speed is suddenly giving you so much more you can do. So that's shutter speed in simple terms. One of the really good things about shutter speed as well is you can be clever with it. There are some wonderful shots. If you have a look on the internet for motor races, for instance, if you use a moderate shutter speed on a vehicle, but you pan with the vehicle will appear in the same place on the shutter, but the background will blur. So it gives an impression of speed. So again, you can use a moderate or even a slow speed to take a moving vehicle, because you're actually panning with the vehicle and keeping it in exactly the same place on the lens, so it stays sharp, but the background will blur. So there's all these things you can do to give an artistic or a pleasing image from there. Does that make sense?
When you take a photograph and you've changed the shutter speed, do you remember when we spoke last time, you showed us changing the f-stop, I think it was it the f-stop? Gosh, this is where I find the 3 areas quite difficult to get my head around. You showed that on the LED screen on the back, you could see, or even look through the viewfinder, you could see whether it got dark or light. Does that happen when you change the shutter speed as well?
It does if you don't adjust the ISO and or the aperture. If you only adjust one of any of those, it will have an effect on the exposure, the amount of light that comes in. So when I go for a faster shutter speed, now faster means less time. So if you remember the hand, I said one was 1/10 of a second, the blurry one. The fast one was 1/640th of a second. But I also said that the aperture on that had changed from f22 on the 10th of a second, the tiny little aperture, not letting much light through, but there was a lot of time that the shutter was open. When I went to the very fast one, I had to have a fully open, an f4 on this particular lens was the lens fully open, an f4 aperture to allow the same amount of light to come through. I also on that actually had to adjust the ISO because it was at the limits of the camera, so I had to make the sensor more sensitive by taking to ISO 400. So yes,
and you did that manually, did you?
I put it on to shutter priority, which is the S or the TV, depending on what the camera that you have is. That gives the shutter. So whatever the shutter does, it will lock that. Whatever you set that to, it locks it, but it allows the others to automatically adjust themselves. And that was what the camera gave me to get the same exposure. If I was shooting fully manually, I would have to adjust it myself.
Okay. But you would see that reflected in the viewfinder.
If you have a mirrorless camera. If you have a DSLR camera, remember you're just looking at the real light, so you've got to be able to judge that. But you do have an indicator, you have a meter which will tell you either by changing the figures, but usually it'll give you a little line which has got the correct exposure on. I don't know if you can see it on my camera. I'll just switch the camera on. You may be able to see it, yes. Right down at the bottom, doubt it's in focus, but there's a line which just went green there. That shows that's my level, but there's another little line below it with a vertical line in the center.
Yeah.
When that's in the center, it shows that you've got the correct exposure, which it thinks.
But on a mirrorless,
manually, you would do that either on a mirrorless or DSLR. But a mirrorless, you can also see the shot. Does my
mirrorless camera have that line? Does it have that?
I can guarantee it does. Almost every camera will have it. So if you switch your camera on and have a look at the information on the back.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I don't know.
We can't quite see it there, but yes, right down the bottom, you can see it just right of center as we see it. You've got that little line. Not easy to see on there. Yeah. It'll be on a different place on different cameras. Some it's on the side. Okay. There's a vertical bar. But what you're trying to do on that is get it round about the center. Now, again, we said about exposure compensation. It's seeing the center as the idealized one, but you might want to change it. We said about the snow last week. Remember, we wanted to actually overexpose. So you would take it to the positive side, even though it says that the center is correct. You would probably take it 3/4 of a stop, maybe a stop and a half to the overexposed side, to the plus side. So that's where the creativity comes in again. Okay. So we've got these 3 areas: speed, ISO, which, if you remember, what did they say the ISO is? Sensitivity of the center, the amount it amplifies, and the f-stop.
Aperture.
Now, the aperture, yeah. What we're going to do on this video, I'm going to keep this video a bit shorter than the others as well, if I can, because we've covered a lot of the hard ground. Those first 2 videos we did, it doesn't seem as if we covered it, but we actually covered probably about 90% of what the reality, the physical part of taking a photograph of the camera is. It's amazing how actually it is very, very simple. The hard part is getting it into there and getting how everything responds. So we're going to keep these videos a little bit shorter. So we've looked at the shutter speed. We've said that parts of a second that it's open, and if you open it for less time, it causes a secondary effect is to have motion blur. So if it's shorter time, it freezes it. If it doesn't, it creates a blurriness, like my hand's blurred there. But we've also talked about the aperture. Now, the aperture, as you said last week, was equivalent to an iris on an eye. You've got the iris, you've got the pupil. The pupil is the actual lens part. It's what goes through, the light that goes through, and the iris gets open and closed to allow more or less light in. And if you look at someone's eye, that will happen naturally with different light levels.
I found that a really useful way because I was getting quite confused about the fact that the smaller the f-stop, the smaller the light getting in.
No.
Oh, sorry, the other way around. That's exactly it.
Around.
Yeah, so the smaller the f-stop, the more light was getting in. And what I had to visualize was the fact that the f-stop is sort of equivalent to how much of the coloured part of your eye you can see.
Exactly. It's
so
the
it's
pupil.
that length.
It's the iris rather than the pupil. If you have a big iris, it's a big number.
Yeah.
If you have a small iris, the small iris is the colour bit, so the iris gets smaller, but because the gap in the middle gets bigger. Yeah.
And I had to get my head around that. That took a little bit of doing.
Takes a little bit of doing. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to share the screen again. I took a couple of photographs. As I say, I literally popped outside this morning to take a couple of photographs just for this. Now, I'll share my screen again. And I'm going to look at that. Where did I focus on that, would you say? What would be my focal? What would be the thing that I've actually focused on? Could you tell anything particular, or is it?
Well, it looks to me like the bit that's in focus is the fence post closest to us.
But the rest of it's fairly well in focus. It's a little bit soft, but it's not too bad. And if you consider that the chairs behind are some 30 feet behind the fence post, almost the whole thing's in some form of focus. Now, this was shot with an aperture of f22, which is the biggest number, which is the smallest hole, the biggest pupil, smallest iris, whatever you like to do. This was shot in f22, the smallest hole that would let light through. Subsequently, the amount of time the shutter was open was only 1/20th of a second. So it was quite a long time that the shutter was open because I was letting less light through. But you can see that almost everything is discernible. Well, everything's discernible in there. You can see the plants, you can see the garden furniture at the back, you can see the fence beyond there, and you can clearly see what it is. I was actually focused on that little bit of snow right on the front of that concrete post, on the fence post.
Yeah.
So you can see that I've got I was probably 4 foot away from that. And you can see that 4 foot away, I've got almost everything in focus, all the way back to pretty much infinity, which is great. It allows you to do shots like that. If you're doing a landscape shot, that's great. You want to be able to get the far hills in, and you want to be able to get the brook in front of you in. So by using something, what they call a depth of field, and I'll come to this in a few moments. I'll explain that a bit better in a few moments. But this depth of field is very, very deep. It goes a long way from almost straight in front of you to as far as you can see. When I change the aperture and put a very low number aperture in, that low number aperture, which is the big opening, which allows a lot more light in, has another secondary effect. Like the shutter speed has a secondary effect about blur.
See, now I think that's a much nicer photograph because my eye is taken to something. The last photograph, my eye was taken to everything and nothing stood out.
Absolutely. This has given a separation between the foreground and the background. Now, it's actually, this one was taken at f1.8. Now, on the lens that you've got on your camera, you can't even get it open that far. I had to use a prime lens, a more expensive lens. This is why lenses become expensive, because to try and get this sort of opening, this amount of aperture opening, is costly. So your prime lenses become costly. But what it does is it gives separation. Now, if you can imagine, this was the portrait that we took of Mark last time. If you're focused on Mark's eyes, on his face, and the background was blurry, you wouldn't worry about, can you remember I said about the door frame?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
wouldn't even notice a door frame. In fact, could you actually tell on that photograph it is a fence beyond the garden furniture? Can you even tell it is properly garden furniture? You can make a chair on the left.
It's certainly hard.
It's
Yeah,
difficult, isn't it?
yeah.
Now, the thing is on this, I don't know if I can zoom this in at all.
You might be able to if you hold your control key and roll your mouse.
Oh, goodness. No, what I'm going
No,
to
it
do
won't
is I'm
let you
going to
do
hide
it.
my video panel.
Or you could
And I
try
can
the little
zoom,
yeah, that one, magnifying
I
glass.
can zoom in on this. And you can see that it's nice and crystal clear on that snow. So we are focused. But you can see that snow, even at the back of that post, is out of focus.
Yeah, yeah.
So the depth of field on this is literally inches, rather than being feet in the first place. Because remember, we could see everything from the from where I was all the way to infinity almost. I can't even get the back end of that post in focus because it is such a shallow depth of field. And if I was to have a slight angle on the fence, you may even find that parts of the fence would be out. And this is a problem when you're taking really shallow depth of field on people's faces. Sometimes it can appear that the face is out of focus because although the eyes are in focus, it's too shallow a depth of field. And the ears and the nose could actually be out of focus. Fascinating when you do those things. How do I get back out of this again? This is going to be the fun thing, trying to get back out of screen share, which I'm not sure how to do it since I got rid of my menu. That's how we do it. So we'll stop sharing that. What we've seen on there is the aperture. So making a very open aperture, very low number, has a very shallow depth of field. Now, what depth of field is this? When you look at someone, if I focus in on your eyes, for instance, I'm just going to mute myself again, just quickly. That's the bad part of having COVID, if you keep coughing. If I focus in on your eyes and I have a very, very shallow depth of field, something like an inch deep, that means that wherever you're focused, it's a very narrow amount of focus between being out of focus in front or out of focus behind. When you have a wide depth of field, that distance where everything's in focus becomes much greater, from almost to the minimum distance that the lens will focus to infinity. And that's dependent on where the f-stop is, where that aperture is set to. So on a portrait, if I was to focus on your eyes, I'd want a depth of field of probably about 6 inches, 6 to 8 inches, if I wanted a really creamy background. Why? So I want your eyes to be in focus, I want your nose to be in focus, your ears, back of your head, but maybe not even your shoulders. If you're slightly turned on for the shoulder, you'll probably find that the rear shoulder would go out of focus, maybe the front. And that gives a real nice separation between the foreground and the background. Gets rid of all the clutter, all the horrible things which interfere. That's no good for a landscape. You're just going to, if you focus on a tree stump, you're going to have a tree stump and nothing else in focus. So again, from the creativity side, this is where you may want to use aperture priority, which is the A. If you have a look on the top of your camera, you've got the little dial that we discussed last week, which has got the different modes. We discussed about having it in the P position, having it in the I auto. I've just mentioned about having it on the S position for the speed, so that by turning the dial will keep the speed to whatever you set it, and allow the camera to do what it needs for the rest. If you set it to the A, and the A is probably the one that most people will use. It's where I leave my camera 99% of the time is on the A position. By leaving it on the A position, you will set the aperture with the wheel, and the camera will sort out the speed to match. Have you got that?
Yeah, well, I'm on A. I'm just wondering what I can take a photograph of. So I've got my Blue Yeti microphone just here. So that actually, if I was to take that, I would want the microphone mesh to be in focus, and it's not doing that. When I look in so I'm on A, but what I've got is a fuzzy microphone, but my water bottle that's about a foot behind it is nice and clear.
Well, you're probably too close for the focusing on that lens. A lens will only focus so close.
Oh, interestingly, when I moved back, the microphone head came into focus and the bottle went slightly out of focus.
Yeah. Because you're looking at your focus point, which is the little green box in your camera. Could be a red box or whatever it is on the camera you've got. You're using that as your focal area. But if you're too close, you'll never get it in focus anyway. So it will decide to focus on something else.
Next time we have a session.
Yeah. So why is it important, these things? Well, this comes again into what we said in the very, very first episode. We don't have a camera to be technically adept. We have a camera to tell a story. We have a camera to make something which is pleasing image to us, which gives an emotional response. Anybody can take the technical side. What we do with this, though, is we allow our technical knowledge to take us to places where a fully automated camera phone or whatever can never do. So what we're doing now is we're saying, okay, then what do we really want? Do I want a shallow depth of field? Do I want a very wide depth of field because I'm taking a landscape or something and I want everything in? It's no good taking a family portrait, for instance, if the family, unless the family are perfectly lined up. I've taken shots on this when I've been doing family portraits, and it catches you out very easily. If your depth of field is too shallow, you'll focus on one person, the rest of the family will be out of focus, even though they're just a foot or so difference away from you. And again, if you're taking a group shot, the people in the center are closer by several feet sometimes than the people at the ends. If you work out trigonometry, there's a big distance to the end, and you'll find that if you have too shallow depth of field, only the people in the center are in focus. And this is where you need these little bits of technical to say, okay, then what's the possible problems? Or if you see a problem on the screen, how do I get around it?
Okay, so interestingly, I got round it by physically moving. Now, if I was up against a wall and couldn't go any further back, what would I do? Would I physically change even though I'm on aperture priority, would I change the
Well,
aperture?
what you just described is slightly different, because if you were out of focus and couldn't focus on that, that becomes a different area, because that's a limitation of the focus of the lens or the zoom of the lens. And we're going to come to a zoom, and we're going to look at focal lengths, as they call it, in a later lesson on this. We're not going to do that now because it's just bringing too much in.
Okay.
But to allow you to change what you see, that's where you'd bring the aperture or the speed in. As I say, if you're wanting motion blur or motion freeze, alter the speed. If you're wanting to look at how that you play with that depth of field, use the aperture.
Right. And
sometimes you've got to have a compromise. So you might want a really shallow depth of field, but that means a very quick, because you've got a very wide open aperture, that would mean a very quick shutter speed. And you think, well, actually, I want some motion blur as well. I want motion blur. Sometimes you do want that. How do I do it? So this is where the third part, the ISO, which we'll cover next week, comes into it. The whole thing is a compromise, but it allows you to be creative. And again, as I've said before, when I first started with photography, many moons ago, you used to get 24 exposures on a roll of film. It used to take you a week to get it sent away to the chemists, the pharmacy, to get your prints back and see if anything came out at all. And if you wanted to experiment, it was incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming. With digital cameras, you can take a dozen shots. It doesn't cost you any more. You can look at them instantly and think, what did I do different on that one to that one? So don't be afraid to play. Get your camera out. And I'm not a great believer in taking hundreds of shots, by the way. That's not what I'm saying, because if you take 100 bad shots, you've still got 100 bad shots. You might get one good one out of it. If you think about a good shot, then it's much more satisfying. But while you're learning, don't be afraid to say, okay, then let's take a photograph of this. Let's take it to an extreme of the aperture one way, click, an extreme of the aperture the other way. Why is it not letting me go that far? Oh, because it's run out of the limits of what the shutter speed will do, or it's run out of the limits of the ISO. So you can play around with it. Click, take a few shots, make a little note of them, take them back home, and then look on the computer and think, why did that work? Why didn't that work? Why is that out of focus? Is that the only thing out of focus, or is it the whole thing? If it's the whole thing, it's possibly motion blur. Why on this one does the person look really prominent in the photograph, yet on that one they don't? And it could be that you just managed to get a really shallow depth of field so that you've got this natural separation, as opposed to, like you said on the first one, it's so cluttered. Everything's in there, including the garden sink, you know, the kitchen sink's in there. So don't be afraid to take the camera out and play with it. You can get on an average camera these days 100,000 shots before you start getting into mechanical problems with the shutter. Most of them are good for 100,000. If you've got some of the pro range cameras, you may get 300,000. That's 1/3 shots. Most people don't go anywhere near that. So you're not going to wear the camera out too much. And if you do, and you've taken that many photographs of it to get to that point, you've probably got such a bug for the photography in the first place. You'll be in your third and fourth camera anyway, because you just love doing the hobby. So don't be afraid of that.
Can I just ask a question, recapping on what we've done? So the very first one the very first video we recorded, we had the camera predominantly on P, which was sort of fully automated, wasn't it? It pretty much did everything. And then we talked about the ISO priority, we talked about the aperture priority, we talked about the shutter speed priority. If we're wanting to go out there and, you know, the eagle is just taking off, or the bird is just flying, and we want to get the best possible chance of getting that shot, and you haven't got time to be thinking about, oh my God, what should I be on? What should I be on? What would be your default?
I don't have a default on that. Even if I'm going to go out just on the fly, I usually have something in mind. If I'm going to be walking in the country and there's a chance that I might be seeing animals, I would probably leave it on the S position, or the TV position if it's a Canon, purely for the fact that that would let me set it up. And I'd probably have pre-dialed in quite a fast shutter speed in the first place, and maybe a medium ISO so that it's round about the center. So I'd probably leave the ISO around about 400 to 800 maybe. And we'll cover ISO next week properly, but about 400 to 800, depending on what the conditions of the day are. But I'd probably leave it on about 500th or 640th of a second, something quite quick, so that it's there to hand. If I'm going off on my holiday snaps and I'm going to be walking along a beach somewhere, and I'm just going to be doing general, I'll probably leave it on aperture priority, and I'll probably leave the aperture round about f8, round about the middle ground, because I want to be able to just get a shot and have most things in focus without worrying. So I don't have a single default. I'll always have something in mind as to what I'm going to and why I'm going there and what I could possibly be using the camera for. It does catch you out sometimes. But again, even if it's on the wrong one, the exposure position, there is the exposure, you can cheat a little bit, because if you have it on, have you got your camera in aperture priority there?
I have at the moment, yes.
Lift it up to your eye.
My battery is about to die.
That's okay, we'll get, but lift up your eye. What's the aperture and what's the speed that you see?
The
half press the button and
aperture is f5.
Yeah.
Speed 25.
Okay, if you wanted to get your speed higher, in other words, faster, it's 25th of a second, you'd open up your aperture slightly. So you could force your aperture to f4. If it'll let you.
It won't. It's go 5 is as low as it'll go.
Okay, point it more towards something light.
It won't. No, it won't go any lower than 5.
Okay. What's the speed saying at the moment?
15.
Okay. If you wanted to make it a slower speed to get more blur, you could close that aperture down, say to f8.
Okay, yeah. Okay, yeah.
What's your speed reading now?
1.3.
1.3 seconds. That's a huge difference in speed. So what you can do, even if you're on aperture priority, you can actually change the aperture and say, okay, normally I'd be wanting about f8, but I'll just ignore that. What's my speed doing? So you're on aperture priority, you can change the aperture manually and see what your speed does, because it will tell you immediately. And if you want faster speed, open up the aperture slightly. Now, you've hit a limitation on yours. I said about prime lenses and why lenses are expensive. Your lens is about f4 to f5.6, if I remember right, for its minimum aperture range.
Mm-hmm.
The lens I took it on before was a 45mm lens, a fixed focal length with a minimum aperture of 1.8, so considerably bigger. So what you can do is, even if you're on the wrong thing for what you'd like then, if you're an aperture priority and you want to take something which you're moving fast, just quickly take the aperture so it's more open.
Okay.
It'll do the shutter speed, or make it more sensitive by upping the ISO. And again, we'll come to that next week. So there's always a way around it. Even if you're on the default, you can still get a shot if you know what's there.
I guess it's a little bit like driving, isn't it? At the minute, I'm still having to think about what the dials do, whereas I get into a car now and I don't have to think about, is my foot on the throttle? Is my foot on the clutch? Is it on the brake? Is this the indicator? I just know where they all are and I go to them automatically.
Exactly. We've covered the what is a gear stick. We've covered the what is a steering wheel. We've covered the what is a throttle and a brake.
Now we have to.
What we're now doing, yeah. What revs do you change gear in your car, Bev?
Not a clue. I'll listen.
You haven't got a clue, but you get that sweet spot in you with a sound and thing. When you first start to learn to drive, you'll have somebody saying, get to about 3,000 revs, and then you put the clutch in and you change up. Okay, right, go for it. Why 3,000 revs? Because that's where the engine's got the bottom of the torque. Who cares? What you've done is you've learned the sweet spot.
Yeah.
What we're doing with this is saying, okay, then we now know what the camera equivalent of the gear stick is. We now know what the camera equivalent of the throttle is, the steering wheel. We know that there's an interaction. In a car, if you're going too fast and you try turning, you'll skid. If you're so you don't go too fast. And this is where the limitations in a car all interact. You don't worry about that when you've been driving for a while. You know these things. Cameras are the same. Once you've done it, this is why I say practice, practice, practice. You'll find that you'll know when something's just not going to work. So you'll adjust it. And if it goes to its limits, you'll think, it's no good. That's going to be bad. So you'll get there. But it is very much like driving.
Yeah. Can we talk about, I realise we're getting quite close to time. Do you want to give me my homework? And I will endeavour to get out and about and do it this time.
Yes, I do. Basically, what I was going to say is on this one, let's do something with the aperture. One of the things I was going to do, but the weather's been particularly difficult at the moment. And as I say, I've been somewhat stuck inside with the illness. One of the things I love to do an aperture test, a little bit of a play. We have a tree stump, which is about 5 foot high, a chopped down tree, and it's wonderful on the side of the road. Find yourself something like that. Now, your camera won't have the extreme creamy background that mine has, because I've got a different lens which is capable of doing that. But on your camera, what I would like you to do is I would like you to go and find something. And I would like you to take a photograph with that as the primary thing. It could be a person. There's nothing wrong with having the person. Remember to focus on the closest eye, but use that person and try it at the extremes of the aperture. So on yours...
So would I have it on A?
Have it on A.
Yeah.
Turn the aperture so that it's as fully open as it'll go. And remember, your minimum aperture changes as the lens zooms, but don't worry about that too much. But I would get yourself fairly close to the person or the object. Do a one at the full minimum aperture and do one at the maximum aperture. And when you do that, just make a note of what happens to the speed.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the first one. That's going to look at aperture and depth of field.
Now, in doing that, what if I remember rightly from some of our earlier ones, you don't need to necessarily be looking at the speed there and then, because if you look at the detail in the photograph afterwards, you'll see comparisons, won't you?
You will see it on there. Usually, if you press the info button on the back of the camera, when you're viewing the pictures, it'll show you. You might have to press the info button a few times so that changes what's displayed. But also, when you bring it down to your computer, if you right-click on the photograph, you can get the ID3 information. That will display as to what's there. We did it last time. If you remember, and just look, if you're interested, look back at edition 2 of this video. That'll tell you how to do it. But do that. That gives you the ability to post-analyze and work out why something's happened. The other thing I want you to do, so that's the first thing. Take a full aperture and a closed aperture of an object. I did say about trying to do something with the shutter speed last time. Go out and take some photographs of a car. Get cars that go straight past it, perpendicular to you. Try one at a very slow speed, so this will be on the S position, on the shutter priority. Take one at a very slow shutter speed, maybe a third of a second, half a second, whatever it is, and try one as quick as it'll go, a thousandth of a second or whatever the extremes that you can reach on the camera will do, as a car passes by, and just see how it changes.
Okay, brilliant.
The third thing.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh, yes, this is, you've covered the things that we've talked about, but I need you doing something for next time as well. The third thing is we're going to be looking in the next edition at what focal length is. I've mentioned focal length a couple of times, and the focal length, it always happens, doesn't it, on these things?
Sorry.
Guaranteed. The focal length is when you've got a zoom. There's a big ring around the camera body. Change that. Have a play around with taking a few photos, one fully zoomed in, so it's what's called its most telephoto, and take one at its widest angle of the same thing. And don't move your feet. Try and stay in the same place and focus on the same thing, but actually do the difference between the two zooms. And that...
Oh, so is focal length zoom?
The zoom changes the focal length, yeah. So we've got introduced a few things on this. We've had the ISO, the f-stop, which is the aperture, and the speed. We've talked about depth of field today, and now we're talking about the focal length of the lens.
Okay.
And that's what we're going to be covering next time, because again, once we've covered these, we've covered almost everything on the camera. The rest of it are whistles and bells. All those knobs and dials and all the menu items that you've got in the back are nothing more than whistles and bells to try and change what these fundamental items of photography are. And what we've covered on this in one form or another, remember ISO is now electronic. It's the electronic equivalent to how sensitive a film was, but it works in the same way. What we are doing with the depth of field, the focal length, the aperture, speed, and sensitivity is what people have been doing since the mid-1800s on photography. We've now got the basics. And after this, everything is cream on top of the cake.
Ornamentation.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Again, I've got my homework. I will get out there and start playing again. So brilliant. Thank you very much.
Not a problem. Just remind everybody, it's on Instagram. It's at Bev Thorogood.
It is, yes.
THOROGOOD.
Too many O's, yes.
Too many O's. And you can get me on YouTube on Brian James. And again, when you get on either of them, hit the subscribe button if you haven't done so already. Put a little like, give us a thumbs up, because again, those things change the algorithms for Instagram and YouTube to get more people watching. And if get more people watching, more people are learning, more people are really enjoying your photography. And what I would say is, now that the light is getting a bit better, go out, get your camera, go out and take some photographs and really enjoy the photography.
Play. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Brian.
All the best, Bev. See you next time.
Bye.